It's going to be a fourth wing theme. Even though it looks complicated, it's actually relatively simple. It's only 4 sections. So this whole badge here is only 3 sections, so it really shouldn't be bad to make. Next, we're going to have the mirrored overall paper side. So this is going to be the back side of your block as you're making it. You're going to use these lines to sew them together. I like to use this particular reference when I assemble the different sections, so A to B to C, rather than the overall fabric side, which is you're not going to be able to see these individual identifiers. You're just going to see the actual fabric that's going to cover here. So this fourth wing badge only has 4 sections. It has A, B, C, and D. I used colored pencils to identify the individual sections and what color they correspond to on the actual paper pieces with respect to the paper side of the overall pattern. I also roughly cut out each of the paper pieces. So we've got, again, A, B, C, and D. I like to cut probably at least another 1/4 of an inch outside of that seam allowance. Then when I go to attach my fabric and sew my fabric, I'll assure the fabric is even past that just a little bit more. 100% make sure that I have enough fabric and I'm not going to run out whenever I go to sew individual pieces together, because that then gets very, very difficult to fix. So once you have all of your sections cut out and colored in, so you know exactly which colors are going where, then it's time to pick out the color of fabrics that you'd actually like to use. So I'm a very visual person, so I like to kind of lay it out all in front of me. I have my background fabric over here on the right, which is going to be my black. I want to make sure that I have enough contrast between everything else to make sure that I can actually see that against the black, which I do. So I'm going to use these for my books. These 2 are going to be the actual badge part for section B, and then this pink and red are going to be a combination for my wings over here. So now I'm going to jump to how we actually sew the individual pieces. So here I've got sections A, B, C, and D for the fourth wing badge block. I already have all of my fabrics picked out. I went ahead and ironed them flat. Now, if you watched week's 1 video for the book spines and the blood ruby, I walked through each individual section piece by piece. So like I did all of section A, then I showed all of section B, and so on and so forth. For this one, I'm actually going to show you how I chain piece, or kind of like assembly line piece whenever I'm doing a block like this. I think it personally saves me time, and I think it moves faster, and it makes my brain happy to see more pieces go together in a quicker amount of time, or at least what I think is a quicker amount of time. So for this one, I'm going to show you that. So I'll walk through each individual piece, step 1, then come back, show you step 2, come back, step 3, and so on and so forth. So for example, for section A here, I'm going to find my A1 fabric, which is going to be my pink. I'm going to make sure that it is wide enough and it's plenty wide enough. I'm going to cut a piece that'll roughly fit. Excellent. And then I need a piece of my background fabric. So that scrap piece that I was talking about earlier, this is actually going to be perfect for A2. So I'm going to put that over here. Now I'm going to move on to my B section. So B1 is going to be turquoise. I'm going to do that. Yeah, that'll be big enough. And B2 is my badge background. That'll be big enough. And then I'm going to move to my C section. Find C1. This one. Ooh, perfect. It'll barely be wide enough. You can, so I kind of hold it up. How I tell this is I will hold up my fabric here, and I've got at least 1/4 of an inch on that side, at least 1/4 of an inch on this side, so it's plenty big enough. If it were, say, like 1/4 of an inch this way and this much fabric left below it, I wouldn't use this piece. I would find a fatter piece of fabric to use, but this one will be perfect. So I'm just going to cut it plenty long enough to make sure that I'll get all of that. And then my background piece. So for my background piece of fabric for C2, I'm going to use that one. And then finally, I'm going to move on to my D. So I'm going to use this guy. So now that I know exactly which fabrics I'm going to go where, I've cut them roughly to the correct size from either my strips of fabric that I cut or leftover scrap fabric. So I'm going to grab my light box and show you how I align the fabrics to the paper. Now, you don't have to have a light box for this. Typically, I will just kind of pinch the paper together like this with my fingers, and I'll actually hold it up to the light, like in the ceiling, and I can see the outline well enough. But for the purposes of kind of a tutorial and showing online, a light box is a lot easier to show that. So you kind of do what works best for you, but you don't certainly have to have a light box if you don't want to. I just think it makes it really simple. So we talked about the paper side and the fabric side. Right. We're looking at our overalls. Technically, this is going to be our paper sides. Remember, everything's mirrored, so the 4 is backwards. And then if we flip over that block, this is what it's going to look like on the fabric. Fabric's going to be right side up. Paper's going to be right side up. So I'm going to put fabric, right side, paper, right side, back sides together. So because we want both of the right sides showing outward, that means we're going to sew wrong sides together. Or for this very first piece, how we set it up is you're going to have the paper on one side so you can see all your individual lines, and then you want your fabric pretty side out. So whenever we're using the light box, just determine where our A1 section needs to go. So when we zoom in here to figure out exactly where we want our A1 fabric, which is going to be this pink fabric, we already have it right side down. So we've got wrong sides together. We want to make sure that there is sufficient fabric on all 4 sides of A1 here. And when I say sufficient fabric, I mean at least 1/4 of an inch. I always like to err on the side of too much. So like this piece of fabric goes all the way up here, all the way down here, here to here. So I've got plenty of fabric all the way around the A1. So I'm going to leave A1 exactly where it's at. And then I'm going to come in with a flathead pin, and I'm going to stick that there. Now you'll notice that I pinned A1 into place parallel to this A2 line. I did that so that I don't have to remove this pin whenever I go to sew it. If I had done it perpendicular to the line, I would have had to remove the pin, otherwise my needle would have hit it and probably broke. So I put the pin in parallel to A2 down here. I am going to trim the seam allowance between A1 and A2 to 1/4 of an inch. I do that by taking my cardstock, put it right on this A2 line, right? So this is the line that we're looking for between A1 and A2. So I'm going to put this cardstock right on that line, fold my paper against it, then I will come in with a ruler and trim it to 1/4 of an inch. Fold that over. I now have 1/4 of an inch of seam allowance for my A1 fabric. How do I know where to attach the A2? Well, we're going to flip it over. On that cut that we just made that was 1/4 of an inch, I'm going to lay right sides together my A2 fabric. I'm also going to put a pin in here to make sure that they don't go anywhere and that they will stay in place. But if I wanted to, say, try it out, I could pin right here at roughly the 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, flip that back over, and then that's what it's going to look like, which is plenty of fabric for this A2 right here. But I don't, like I said, I don't want to leave my pin that high up because my sewing needle will hit it. So I'm going to pin it down here. So now we got A1 attached. I'm going to do the same thing for section B, C, and D, and then I'm going to go sew that line. On to section B, I'm going to grab my B1 fabric, which is going to be this teal. I'm going to get my light box. Teal's going to go right side down. If you want to skip a trimming step between your B1 and B2 lines, so you don't have to trim it to 1/4 of an inch, you could if your B1 piece of fabric is straight enough or has at least a single straight edge, you can actually line it up there so that there's already 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So that means that I wouldn't have to trim that. Just again, it saves me time. If that's confusing for you, don't do it. Just continue doing it the way that you've always done. But now we're going to pin it, flip this over, and that will be exactly where our B two-piece goes, just like that. Now we're moving on to the C section. So I'm going to need C1, which is going to be pink, and C2 is going to be background. I'm going to put right side of fabric down, line it up over C1. I'm going to, again, try my little technique where I don't have to trim it between C1 and C2. That's aligned pretty well. I've got plenty of room all around the C1 borders that are 1/4 of an inch. Put a pin in C1. I had to make sure I didn't actually stab my screen. Then C2, right sides together, and put a pin in that. When I go to sew on the sewing machine, I'm going to reduce my stitch length to 1 and sew along this here. Now I'm going to extend the stitches out. This is going to be on every single stitch that I make in paper piecing moving forward. I'm going to extend the stitch out about 1/4 of an inch on either side of that line. That ensures that the next line overcompasses that, and so it ties it in. So using this, you don't have to stop and start every time. And due to all of the very close intersections and like number of details, I would not recommend stopping and starting, like doing a back stitch and then going over here to this line and doing another back stitch. You really want to make sure that you have your lead in edge and your lead out edge to make sure that you don't have any pieces that kind of come apart and start to fray once your quilt is assembled, washed, and especially if it gets used all the time. Just want to make sure it's safe and sound and secure. So I always do that because, again, my quilts are made to be used and they should be durable. So that is C1. Moving on to D section, that's going to be our book. That's going to be a jellyfish with this dark border fabric. Put jellyfish right side down, align it. I will take a pin. So for these big sections like this, I will actually add in another pin down here just to make sure that the fabric doesn't move on me. So I know using the light box, we're at 1/4 of an inch all the way around. So now we are done with the light box for the entirety of the 4th wing badge block. We are going to now add this D2 section. So I'm going to roughly trim, and I will take my cardstock right along the D1 to D2 line, fold, and trim to 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to save both this piece of fabric that I cut off. So now we've got the D1 section attached. That'll be the fabric for D2. When we flip it over, that's what it'll look like, which would be great. Now you'll notice that you see a paper over here. So sometimes when I said at the very beginning of this that I always have my fabric overlap my paper, sometimes when I see this, I'll start to freak out and think that my fabric isn't quite big enough, because you can obviously see the paper here. But just remember that we have a bunch of extra paper on this side, and I confirmed it with the light box already. So if that really bothers you, you can absolutely come and trim along and remove this paper, because there's plenty over here. So I actually might do that moving forward just for kind of some peace of mind. So we trimmed along the D2 line, attach that there, and hold it in place with a pin. So the reason that I kept the scrap pieces of jellyfish fabric is that these will be plenty big for the D5 piece right here. They're going to be plenty wide enough so I can reuse that. And D3 is plenty wide enough for me to use this piece, really in either direction. So that's why I keep these, because I'm going to, again, reuse them on the exact same block once it's their turn. And I'm going to remove the pin that I added, because we are now going to sew this A3 line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the line A3. So sometimes I think about the sections like A8 is this whole piece here, right? Like as you're filling in the colors, yes, that is absolutely correct, is that this whole chunk here is A8 and it needs to be this pink color. But when you go to look at which lines to sew on next, think of it kind of as connecting the dots. So this is going to be the A2 line. What's after 2? Now it's going to be your 3rd line. So now this is going to be your number 3 line that you just sewn. Moving on, now you have your number 4 line. So now your number 4 line will technically encompass your number 3 line, which is good. And then so you're going to keep on building upon that. Then you're going to go to your number 5 line, number 6 line, number 7 line, number 8 line, and so on and so on and so on. So again, I think about it as an engineer. I am an engineer, so I come at it from a pretty analytical standpoint. But I think that if you break it down into those small pieces, those small steps, it becomes intuitive after not a very long period of time. So I'm going to now go and trim along the A3 line. So what I did here is I've got my A3 line right here, put my cardstock along it, fold, and then I could grab my ruler, or I could just roughly cut 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now I'm going to move on to my next piece, which is going to be pink, which I cut these in correctly, so that's going to be my red. I'll make it like this long. That'll fit. Flip it over. The line I just cut for the 1/4 inch is where I'm going to put it. Now, where do you put it with regard to here? So you have this whole line of fabric was cut at 1/4 inch. So how do you know kind of Z space where to put it? Well, what I do is I look on the back side and I want it to be roughly here. So I'll flip it over and put it in roughly the same spot again. But to confirm, I'll put my fingers on either side of the end of the piece of fabric, and I'll put them on the matching side on the back side. So the A3 line we want to sew is here, and you can tell that my fingers are very far away from that. So I'm going to have plenty of fabric, and that's aligned correctly. So I'll put that here and put a pin in it just to make sure it doesn't move. Moving on to section B, I'm going to find B3 and trim that to 1/4 inch. And then again, I'm showing you how I quickly go through and kind of chain piece mine. So because B3 and B4 are completely separate of themselves, meaning they don't have to be sewn in order. So I could sew B4 right now and B3 wouldn't be affected. Or I could sew B3 right now and B4 wouldn't be affected. So I'm going to sew those both at the same time. Again, if as a beginner, if that sounds confusing, just don't worry about it. Continue to sew in order. But I'm just kind of showing you the tips and tricks that I use as a advanced and proficient paper piecer to kind of make things go faster for me. I'm going to put my cardstock along the B4 line and again roughly trim it to 1/4 inch. You could use a ruler if you wanted to, or just freehand it. So my yellow is actually teal because again I colored them the wrong color, but it's okay. So I'm going to use B3 and B4. Yeah, I'll use that. I'm going to go over to B3. Put it right sides together. I'm gonna pinch and flip, and I'm plenty far away, so that'll be perfect. And then I'm going to pin in place. At the same time, I'm not going to pin it in place because the excess fabric will be covering the A4 section. But I'm going to manually take this over to my sewing machine, and after I sew the B3 line, I'm going to flip this up and just hold it in place manually while I sew the A4 line. So I'll show you after I finished it. Again, as you kind of go through paper piecing and get more comfortable, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Moving on to the C section, I'm going to take away my flathead, grab my cardstock, find C3, cut C3. So because this is a little bit of a longer piece and a little bit of a weird angle, I did go ahead and decide to use my ruler for that one. But you could have freehanded it if you'd like to. I'm going to use red. And that'll be big enough. Quite enough. Yep. Put it there along the line we just cut. Pinch and pinch. Plenty of fabric. Pin it in place. Now I'm on to my D section. I can remove this pin because the paper is being held in place by the D2 line. I'm now going to trim the D3 line to 1/4 of an inch. I'm back to my jellyfish print. I'd like to make sure that they're like kind of lined up like that. So I'm actually going to pin them just like this and pin that in place. And then again, whenever I'm going to sew, I'm going to start out here, sew all the way. At the B section as promised. So I showed attaching or pinning the B3 in place, but we couldn't do the B4 because the excess fabric from B3 was folded over. So here's what the backside looks like. So this is what I attached first. So as you can see, the fabric actually did move on me a bit, and I got real close over here, but I have enough fabric during in the actual meat part of the B3 section that it's fine. So I sewed that line, then I manually flipped this up and just held it with my hand, and then I came down here and I sewed the B4 line right there. So now when I go to sew them open, or I'm sorry, whenever I go to iron them open now, I'll have both B3 and B4 done kind of at the same time with minimal interruptions in between. So now we're on to section A4. Now here is going to be similar to the B section that I just talked about. A4 and A5 can both be sewn at the same time because they're not going to interrupt themselves. The space down here. So I'm actually going to trim A4 first, but I'm going to cut a piece of the background for A5 as well. So I'm going to find the A4 line, fold, push the fabric back, seeing because the bits of thread like to stick to the paper, which again is good. Kind of holding it in place. I just pull those threads out the perforated paper. Now we've got our A4 line cut to 1/4 of an inch. A4 is my pink fabric. Is this wide enough at the widest point? Yes, it is. I'm just going to cut a long piece to make sure it's got enough length. But yeah, that's fine. So that'll be my A4. I'm also going to come down here and cut A5 from my background. And for the A5, I'm going to use that piece. So I'll pin A4 into place and sew that. And then I'll manually fold that over and sew A5. But I'm going to scoot this up just to make sure I have enough in the seam allowance. This last time I did not. On to the B section. So if you lose track of which kind of pieces you've already sewn and like what your next number is, especially if you're chain piecing like this, you can just go in and cross out B1 I've sewn, B2 I've sewn, B3 I've sewn, B4 I've sewn. So now I'm going to sew B5 and B6. Again, because they don't interact with each other, I can sew them at the same time and save some time. These are going to be this light blue, and I'll do that one for B5. I'm going to sew B5 in order first. So now we're on to our B section, and if you'll notice, I can cross out B1, B2, B3, and B4 because I've already sewn them. So I'm just going to put a little X through there so I don't lose my place or forget which one I'm sewing on next. Now I'm going to move to B5, and B6. Because, again, these don't interact with each other or intersect at all, I can sew them at the same time. Following my general sew order, I'm going to come in here, fold along the B5 line, and trim to 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. I'm also going to come down here to B6 and trim to 1/4 inch seam allowance so that I can manually fold that over just like I did the last time, but manually fold that over on the machine after I sew it. Attach this guy. Again, we're going to pinch and pinch, flip over, plenty of room. We're good to go. Oh, interesting. So this has a cut right here in the center of it. Glad I saw that. So I'm going to trim that bit off and throw it away, and then now recenter this because I don't want any cuts in the middle. Pinch and pinch. Plenty. I'm actually going to scoot this down a bit. Pinch and pinch and flip. Plenty of room. I will pin that in place and take that over to sew. Plus I've got the manual B6. Very similar to section A. I'm now going to sew C4 and C5 kind of in the same step and cut them at the same time right here. I'm going to sew C4 first, then C5. So C1, 4, I'm going to find the C4 line. Fold that. Now I know these may seem like kind of odd angles to work at, which some of the pieces are at odd angles, and I can understand that it's difficult to kind of wrap your head around the orientation. Think of it in strips. If you had a 1.5 inch wide piece of fabric, it would cover all of that. So I kind of think about it in widths. So I know that the width of this fabric is going to be plenty wide enough for that, 1/4 inch on each side. So I know that this strip of fabric is perfectly fine for C4. Now to cut it to length, just kind of lay it on top of there and then cut excess fabric. Nothing crazy, nothing like hardcore measurements or anything. It's all just kind of eyeballing it to make sure that your piece fits. I'm also going to now trim C5. And find a piece of background fabric for C5. Now whenever you're doing like quick cuts like this, make sure that your foundation paper piece isn't underneath of it, otherwise you'll cut it off. Attach C4. Make sure there's plenty of fabric on all the sides, and there are. Pins so it doesn't move. And then manually, after I sew C4, I will come down here and sew C5. Now we're back to our D block. I know I said that we removed pins after I ironed them flat. However, I'm going to go ahead and add a pin back in down here because this book flap keeps on moving around on me, and I don't want to actually get it caught in like a seam allowance or when I cut. So we've done D1, D2, D3. We're on to D4, which is our dark fabric. We're going to cut 1/4 inch seam allowance. And attach D4. And just like all the other times, we're going to start out here, so all the way over to that section. So here's our progress report of A, B, C, and D. We'll flip all these over, and they're starting to look a little bit more like not just some random lines of color. Like this one almost looks like a 4 now. So let's continue on with our chain piecing, and we'll move. So we did A4. Again, I'm going to cross out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now we're on to A6. So you can see that now that we've completed A4, A5, we're on to the A6 line, which is this one right here. As you can see, A7 interacts with or intersects this A6 line, so we can't sew these at the same time. So now we're going to just go back and again sew one piece at a time. Have your lead in edge, have your out edge down here, and then sew on that A6. I'm going to grab my cardstock and trim to 1/4 inch. Pull the paper taut, and then I'll kind of like put my finger down and then push. Now if your stitches aren't coming free from the paper very easily, they should come out as easily, like I said, just like that, just barely any pressure. But if they don't, that may mean that you're using too big or too large of a stitch length, that the paper is not perforated enough for it to easily tear out. So now my A4 section, it's going to be, again, pink. It's going to be plenty long enough. Move this down here. I'm going to pinch and pinch, make sure it is long enough. It's perfect. It's perfect down there. Perfect right here. And and then add a pin. I'm going to our B section. So we just sewed B6 and B5. Now I'm going to sew B7 again because B8 intersects. You can't sew it at the same time, but next time around I'll sew B8 and B9. But now we're on to the B7. Yellow is my turquoise. Let's see if I have a long skinny piece, and I do. Use that for B7. Put it on right along the B7 line. Fold. Trim to 1/4 inch. And fold over again. Make sure I have enough fabric by pinch and pinch, and I got plenty of it. Pin in place. C section, we're on to C6. Fold along the C6 line, trim to 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I will scrap, toss all of these little pieces, all of the crumbs I will throw away, but I don't actually put them in the garbage. I collect all of them in the remnant paper and I'll throw them in the compost bin here whenever the weather warms up a little bit. Okay, I'm on C6. That'll be plenty long enough. Probably a little too wide, but that's okay. Flip it over and line up. Pinch and pinch. I know for a fact I'm going to have plenty of fabric. Yep. Now we're on to G5, which is the last section in D before that book is done. That's why I like just regular books. They go together so quickly. There's also several filler books available on the Nerdy Quilter website. I'll have 3 filler books in this quilt along, which were released week 1. But there's also probably 15 or so other book or jar blocks that you could download to kind of add in where you see fit. You can use fun fabric, or if, again, you just want to kind of speed up the finished product of your quilt, those go together really easy. So I want to continue this same piece of fabric that I cut from, so it kind of like, you can see the whole jellyfish throughout the book. So what I wanted to do is make sure that this is wide enough. If I hold it up, it's going to be plenty wide enough. I have a 1/4 inch down here, as well as a 1/4 inch plus some up here. So that'll be perfect. I'm going to flip it over. I'm going to roughly align it. Put a pin in it to make sure it doesn't move. So here you'll notice that A7 is the same color as A4 and A6. So this is the first time I'm testing this pattern. So what I'll probably do, which is a little different than what this video will show, but by the time the pattern comes out, I'm actually going to extend this line here. Yep, I'm going to extend that line here. So all of this will be A4 and all of this will be A6. So your A7 and this will get pushed out. So now this will be A7, 8, 9, 10. You can figure it out. Still follow it in those orders, but just know that that's why the pattern's going to look a little bit different for you. Same with on the C section. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to extend this line out, make this 6 and all of this 4. The joys of testing patterns. But if you wanted to keep it this way, you still absolutely could. It's not going to hurt the pattern, hurt the block or the image by any means. It's just one extra sew line. So you'll notice that I got kind of wonky there and got a little bit close. That's another great reason to use your ruler every time you trim, to make sure you don't get anything too short or too close. And make sure I got lots of extra fabric there and pin it. And I can pinch and pinch to make sure that I've got sufficient fabric, and I do. Moving on to the B section, I just sewed B7. Now I'm going to sew B8 and B9 at the same time. B8 and B9. Both of these are going to be that blue color. Got that one there. Is this enough for down here? It is. I'll pin B8. So I'm going to pin B8, pinch and pinch, make sure it's sufficient, and it is. And then because these aren't very close, I can actually go ahead and pin B9 as well, because they're seam allowances won't interact with each other. Yeah, the reason I couldn't do this on some of the previous sections is because this piece of fabric here would actually like be overlapping down here, so you'd sew on top of it, which you wouldn't want to. But here we have enough room between them that we can actually pin these at the same time. So section C is going to be the same that I just talked about with section A, where your C7 is going to look a little different than mine, just because I'm going to reduce one of the numbers here, one less seam for anyone to have to sew or worry about. And section D is done. So I'm just going to do a super quick trim of him. And I made sure that my fabric was wide enough at the top that even though I have some seam allowance or some selvage up there, by the time I trim my 1/4 inch seam allowance, I will have plenty of fabric with none of that white line on there. So D is done, so I'm going to set that aside until I am completed with A, B, and C. A, B, and C. And if we flip those over, again, it doesn't look like a whole lot now, but at least the colors are kind of start to come together. Don't feel like you have to do this, but I can look ahead and see that A8 is not going to interact with A12, so I'm going to go ahead and sew A12 at the same time. Again, if you're a beginner and this is confusing, keep on sewing in the order. So we just sewed 7, now sew 8, 9, 10. For yours, that'll be backwards. This will probably be 7, 8, and 9. So just follow along if you'd like to. Otherwise, continue doing the methodology that we've talked about to date. Trim to 1/4 inch. I'm going to go over here. So if you have extra fabric like this, you can also just trim loosely. Just make sure you don't cut into the actual paper. That would be bad. But you can trim off the excess. I'm going to find 12 here. So my camera died while I was finishing up these other blocks. But you can see that the individual pieces here for A, B, and C just continued using the exact same techniques that we started with. Just, again, follow number order. Think of them as lines. There was really no specific hard ones. It can get a little bulky, the seams can, down here in these areas. I'd recommend just go slow on your sewing machine. Don't go pedal to the metal. So whenever you get to some of these areas, just go slow and steady. But you shouldn't have any issues getting it through your machine at all. Like none of the seams in pretty much any of the patterns in the quilt along are going to be extremely bulky. Again, with the exception of the Sprite Eye. The one kind of thing that I do want to point out is B26 is a pretty large section of background fabric. And whenever I attached one of my strips there, it turned out that it was a little too short. So you can see there's a seam right here. But whenever I sewed this strip of fabric on, trimmed it, this corner of paper was still showing. So all I did was just add another line here and pretend that this is like a B27. So just added one more section. Again, it's not interfering with any other lines or sections down here. So it's totally fine to add another piece. So this can be really helpful if you have very large sections of like specifically background fabric. You don't have to use such big cuts of fabric, which I think can be kind of difficult to work with. And the addition of another seam here, technically I don't need to add a pin down here to hold it in place like I do with this book. Because there's no seams down here, this is very floppy and not attached, so I have a flathead pin. With this one, I don't need to do that. So that's just kind of again, I'm showing you kind of how I piece myself whenever I'm just making something for me and not going step by step through it. So let's now sew these together and attach the different sections. So what we're going to want is all 4 of our sections, A, B, C, and D, are sewing order. So on the title page, we're going to look about halfway down, and that'll be our sewing order. So we're going to sew A to B, then to C, then we'll sew D together. So if you're following this sew order with the parentheses, which again, whenever I update the pattern, I might actually take these off. What you can do is sew A to B, and then at the same time sew C to D. So you're going less trips back and forth to the ironing mat, to the cutting mat. I think it just speeds up the process. Because I'm testing this pattern, by the time that it gets published, this may be slightly different. So I'm going to look at my paper side overall piece. So I talked about how my brain really likes to work off of the paper side. That's because I don't have to flip anything this way. So I'm going to match my different sections up. So I've got D on the left-hand side, and then C, and then B, and then A. So in my sew order, I'm going to attach A to B, A to B. So that means that this is going to be my seam allowance for those two. And then I have, again, I'll update this parentheses, C plus D. That's going to be this. So now that we know exactly which seams we're going to sew together in these orders, I'm going to use my 24-inch ruler. You could also probably use a 12.5-inch ruler. You just want to make sure that there's plenty of acrylic ruler on either side so that you can get a good straight edge whenever you cut. I am going to trim along the dotted line, which is 1/4 inch seam allowance, everywhere where I have marked this seam in red. So I'm right-handed, so this is typically how I like to work, is I'll lay everything out and then I'll just kind of cut it in one fell swoop. I line it up on the black solid line, 1/4 inch. The edge of my ruler is along the dotted seam allowance line. If you find that it's difficult to cut through the paper and the fabric, like as you cut, you either have to push down really, really hard, or it's still not cutting through some of the seams, I would recommend changing out your rotary cutter blade. So a new blade will work absolute wonders, and it's amazing how much nicer and smoother the new blade is. One of the downsides with paper piecing is the amount of paper that you have to cut. With your rotary cutter, it will dull it pretty quick. So I just use the same rotary cutter for everything, but I could definitely understand people that would have, say, a paper piecing rotary cutter and like another one that they use for just straight up fabric. So after we have our seam allowances trimmed, so we have confirmed that they are all 1/4 inch wide. We have them in the correct layout. We are going to sew them in the correct order. So we've already confirmed that this is 1/4 inch, and we've cut it straight with our straight edge, so we know that whenever they are aligned, even just by hand, that they'll be exactly, whenever you sew on one black line, the other black line on the back side will be perfectly aligned. So they'll both be 1/4 inch. But we still have to worry about the Z direction, like how tall of books and where to align with the height of it. If you go through and trim along the dotted line before you assemble any sections, you could certainly align just the top of this section here. So this fabric wouldn't be here, this paper wouldn't be here. You just align it and go. I don't like to trim my seam allowances like that early. So I only trim along the line that I'm going to be sewing on, and then I'll use a round pin to stick through. So it's gonna be, make sure I do this right. Yep, so I've got D plus C. I'm going to align this corner and this corner together. I'm going to do right sides facing each other. I'm going to have that pin right at the intersection of the corner. And I'm going to put it on the matching side back here. This is a little bit of guesswork, so you may have to pin it and repin it a couple of times until you get exactly in the corner. Oh, no, I had it exactly in the corner, about like that. Then all you're going to do is make sure, I like to use gravity to help me out, just make sure that these are aligned, just like that. I'm going to use some wonder clips and attach them together, but all I have to do now is sew along the black solid line, and section C and D will be attached. Yep, so I just added just a couple of wonder clips to ensure that everything stays aligned, nothing moves on me, but I'm going to sew along the solid line here on this side, and then it will match perfectly over here. I'm also at the same time going to take my A and B over to the sewing machine. I'm going to once again choose to align the blocks up here. So now I'll take another pin, put it through this corner intersection of A, right sides together with B, put it through the corner section of B, align along the 1/4 inch seam allowance, place a wonder clip, 1/4 inch seam allowance, place another clip, and you're going to take this over to your sewing machine and sew along the solid black line here. So the seam where you sew section A to B, and likely whenever you attach C to B, this area in here is going to get pretty bulky. Like, there's several seams that intersect. You've got several seam allowances, so you've got multiple layers of fabric. It's completely doable. You shouldn't have any issue getting through those layers of fabric, but because it gets a little thicker, I just recommend slowing down your speed a little bit. So kind of slow and steady through these areas. That way, if you hit an extra bulky spot, your fabric doesn't jump or your needle doesn't jump. And it just makes things a little more secure. So we're still not going to remove the paper from the piece. However, because we're going to fold these open and iron them open, I'm going to remove the paper from the seam allowance. So it should tear out pretty easily. It's coming pretty quickly. Here's where the tweezer comes in handy. You can just grab them super, super quick, and it just pulls right out. I like to be as accurate here as possible, because if you leave any paper in there, again, it makes the seam a little bulkier, excuse me. But I also just don't want to have paper stuck in between my quilt whenever I go to sandwich it and then wash it afterwards and use it. So far, I am a fan of this recycled paper. It is tearing very, very easily. So far, I like it. I'm going to go iron these open real quick, but that's what we've got. Flipped over. And opened. So while steam is optional when you're piecing the individual sections together, I would highly, highly recommend steam whenever you go to attach the A section to B section, C section to D section, because it really makes them lay flat and just makes them easier to trim. So there's our block. We only have one more seam left, which is to attach these two together. So if I flip it over onto the paper side, now I will be attaching DC to AB. So this is the seam that I'm going to trim to 1/4 inch, and those are the corners that I'm going to align on. So again, if we compare it to our paper side overall mirror, we have D, C, B, A, order is correct, excellent. So these are the two corners that we're going to use to align the AB section to the CD. We're going to do that by taking our pin, putting it in the corner of the BA block, right sides together, put it in the matching corner of the CD block. It may take you a couple of pins. There we go, got it. Let gravity help you align those. Align the 1/4 inch seam allowance. Should be pretty easy because the paper really helps stiffen things up. Now you can take that pin out and you're going to go sew along this line here. So the entire block has now been sewn together. We just did AB to CD. We have our 1/4 inch seam allowance. We've sewed right along that black line. Notice there's a little bit of misalignment from one side to the other. It doesn't really matter. You don't have to be exactly on. That is why I leave extra, that's why I leave extra paper and then extra fabric beyond the lines that are recommended, is because sometimes I'm not extremely accurate, and so that just ensures that I have enough fabric to account for my inaccuracies. We're going to remove all of the paper from that seam allowance and go iron it open. So here's the paper side of our finished block. I can now take out that last flathead since the seam here is going to hold in that piece of paper. And here's the block flipped over. I think that the colors really pop off the page. Everything aligned like I thought it would. The seams weren't too bulky, and this wing over here will get tidied up whenever we attach another block to it. So if you take out the 1/4 inch seam allowance over here, it'll match the one on the right hand side. So compared to the title page, I think this looks pretty good. Again, I went with some more bold, vibrant colors, but that's the color scheme that I'm going for. I think that this would also look really cool if you did it in like blacks and golds. I want to add another book to the left of it that has lightning fabric on it. I think that would be a really cool addition and kind of an Easter egg call out. I'm glad I went with the jellyfish over here because they're fun, but I want to add a lightning bolt next to this to, again, just further reference the 4th wing pattern. So the only thing that is left to do is to trim to 10.5 inch square and then remove the paper. I typically will leave my blocks in this condition until I'm completely done with all of them and ready to start assembling. So like say I'm going to do a 4x4 bookcase. That's going to be a total of 16 blocks. I will leave the paper and them untrimmed, unsquared up until I finished all 16 blocks. It doesn't matter when you trim them up or when you remove the paper, but that's just the way I do it. I think it helps prevent fraying and kind of easier for them to store flat. I didn't say this, but don't remove the paper at any point in time before this step. With the exception of the seam allowances where we attached the 2 different sections, the paper needs to stay on. Now, if you have a 10.5 inch ruler, like this one, you can remove the paper and you can use the ruler to attach to ensure that everything's 10.5 inch. But typically what I like to do is I will use the exterior markings along the block. So we have our dotted line that's 10.5 inches and the solid line is going to be 10 inches. I will use those as a reference guide for my 10.5 inch ruler. Sometimes I'm not extremely accurate and say the dotted line may not be straight on one side. That can happen for more complicated and intricate patterns. I mentioned the fire sprite several times, but for the fire sprite, some of the lines get a little mixed up and a little kind of out of shape. But if you use the 10.5 inch ruler, it doesn't matter because it's already going to be a straight edge and it's already going to be a square as long as you use that as a template. So I really like this, but you could certainly use your 24 inch by 6.5 inch ruler to trim it up and then measure 10.5, trim it up, measure 10.5, etc. But I like the specific 10.5 inch ruler size just because I think that makes it easier and it takes some of the human factor out of it. I don't have to measure exactly 10.5 inches. It's just always the same size. So here is the finished 4th wing block. Comment below if you have any questions or if you want to see something in more detail. This is just, again, my first couple of sets of videos, so I'm still learning, still trying to figure out exactly what to explain, how to explain it. But any other topics you'd like to see, like I said, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks.